A lot of my research is concerned with museums and heritage. And I was part of a move of people trained in social anthropology, where the work was mainly done outside Europe, part of a move to come back and look at Europe itself. I worked on various topics, but I really became very, very interested in museums and heritage, because it seemed to me these were often taken for granted as institutions in our society. But they're extraordinarily important, because what goes on there is people are figuring out what kinds of things should be pushed into the future. So they're about future making.
How do you choose which objects and artifacts should be exhibited in museums? What processes underpin the decisions? These are the kinds of questions addressed by the distinguished ethnologist Sharon Macdonald, who is set to head a new Center for Cultural Heritage and Museum Research in Berlin, initiated by Humboldt-Universität, the Museum für Naturkunde, and the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz. Alexander von Humboldt Professor Macdonald will also be a mentor and consultant for concrete exhibition projects in Berlin, such as the one at the Museum für Islamische Kunst. Here she meets the director of the museum, Dr. Stefan Weber, who introduces her to his new exhibition concept. His particular idea is to integrate the exhibits into a landscape of discovery with a court garden and fountain.
Partly what's going on there is conveying Islam as peaceful, as museums are very capable of doing, actually through trying to kind of evoke your feelings.
To present Islam as an inviting culture is not something to be taken for granted nowadays. Islam is the object of both political and social criticism. To what extent can art be separated from politics and religion in the Islamic world? How do museums respond?
In some cases, I think they try to seal themselves off by saying, but we're just making scientific decisions. I'm not saying that's what's happening in this particular case, but whatever they do is going inevitably to be looked at in relation to what's going on in society more broadly. I mean, Berlin for me is just this fantastic lab of exciting things, historically important things that are going on in the museum landscape.
The best example of this is the Humboldt Forum, a huge exhibition project in the reconstructed Berlin Palace. In 2019, the non-European ethnological collections of the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz will start to move into the major part of the buildings. Macdonald's expertise as a museum researcher is in demand.
In relation to visitor research, we could try to help provide understandings of how certain things might be seen, and therefore possible risks in how, for example, certain stereotypes would come into play. There'd be the scope for at least addressing those and trying to tackle them head on. So those would be some of the kinds of things that I could potentially do with a research team to help enable that.
It is to the Humboldt Forum that the Humboldt-Universität will also move parts of its collections. One particular gem is the Laut Archive, the sound archive, which has its origins in a collection of gramophone recordings made during the First World War.
The Laut Archive is an extraordinary place. Those recordings, they were collected in prisoner of war camps. And sometimes what was going on was that people were talking. They were perhaps asked to give a traditional song, but in fact they actually did something quite subversive. They made up a song about what was going on politically and so on. So kind of hidden in this material, you've got these other stories.
the Museum for Naturkunde, Berlin. This is not only home to impressive species, but also a major research center. As a member of the Leibniz Association, the Natural History Museum focuses on the evolution and biodiversity of living creatures. How did the diversity of life forms develop? More than 500,000 people visit the museum every year, a good basis for exciting collaboration.
One of the areas that's very interesting is that museum really wants to do a lot of work on visitor engagement, and that gives us a good opportunity to work with them to think about what constitutes diversity, what constitutes sameness, what constitutes, for example, a species. Now, a really interesting thing in that museum is that's actually thrown out as a question rather than given as something obvious.
There are more than 30 million items in the collections held by the Naturkunde Museum. But just as in other museums across the world, only a tiny proportion can be exhibited. Professor Macdonald says we are experiencing a period of cultural abundance.
And what we see with museums is that their storerooms are just packed with things that are never going to go on display. Then some has to be shown, but not all can be shown. So there are inevitably selections having to be made all the time, and that's an incredibly difficult matter. And I think that's one of the really big challenges, actually, of our time.
Select exhibits and evaluate concepts, Sharon Macdonald wants to develop decision-making tools. At the new Centre for Museum Research, she will therefore combine museum theory and intercultural comparative studies with the work of curators in the museums.